momentum or inertia, as if the strings had been cut. He went down with all the subtlety of a bag of odd-sized rocks. The medic dropped to the young man's side and surveyed the wound, probing it with his index and middle fingers. It was mortal. The single bullet had entered in his back, just below his right kidney. It was a small, circular puncture that had already closed upon itself, hardly even bloody. But in front, where it had tumbled out of a jagged hole to the left of his navel, the accompanying shock wave had liquefied everything in its path. Jimmie Carl jabbed him with a morphine syringe and looked into his eyes. Ordinarily, he'd have painted a big M on his forehead with mercurochrome to alert the docs at the aid station about the morphine. But this time it didn't matter. This one wasn't going to make it that far. Jimmie Carl stuffed the wound with a thick wad of gauze, and then stripped off his belt and cinched it tightly around Evans's middle to try to at least hold his guts in till he could get him somewhere better to die. Better to die? Jimmie Carl knew he should leave Evans and try to rejoin the other men now nearing the covering trees. Evans was dead, he just hadn't stopped breathing, and there was nothing that was going to change that. But the lieutenant and the other men, however many were still alive, would be needing all the help they could get. Jimmie Carl knew all of this, but he also knew that it didn't matter. This was his day of atonement. That moment, that one crystalline point of time when you are granted the opportunity to put the mistakes of the past to rest and square your soul with God. Jimmie Carl wasn't going anywhere. He wasn't leaving Evans. Hoisting the young private onto his back and shoulders, Jimmie Carl recalled a series of bomb craters that the platoon had passed on its way in from the LZ before they were hit. They offered the best cover. The only cover. They were also 500 meters away, a stroll on a good day, a lifetime today. Jimmie Carl picked up the wounded Marine's heavy M14 and began running. As he did so, Evans bobbed up and down on his shoulders. Each time the young private expelled a strained grunt of air, like some huge human bagpipe. And each time the grunt grew quieter, as more and more air was squeezed out and wasn't replaced. Jimmie Carl ran in a straight line, the shortest distance to the end zone. Razor grass shredded his shins. The heat and wet were oppressive and sat on his chest like a sack of moistened concrete, and Evans, small as he was dead weight, wet, sticky, dying weight. Jimmie Carl could smell bowel, and his sunburned neck and back prickled and stung from bile and stomach acid that leaked from Evans's shredded gut. The far bomb crater they had passed, the one closest to the tree line, the one that offered the best hope of survival, kept receding as he ran, farther and farther away with each step, and he felt like he was treading in waist-deep sorghum, and all the while automatic weapons fire kept stitching a path in front of him. His lungs bursting, Jimmie Carl dove into the first crater he came upon, throwing Evans in before him. The wounded private hit the ground and lay still, no longer even groaning. Jimmie Carl quickly pried open one of the boy's half-closed eyes with a muddy thumb. The iris had shut down, and it was dark and unresponsive and clouding up like it had been buffed with steel wool, either from death or from the effects of the morphine. Yet he was still breathing. A wet, stuttering, bubbling sound percolated from deep within. Evans was a skinny black kid from a shotgun shack outside Greensboro, North Carolina. He stuttered and got tongue-tied when anxious, which was most of the time, and had opted for the Marine Corps only when it was presented as the option to another run at the state pen 3-5 for Grand Theft Auto. 3-5 versus 1 and out in a place he had never heard of, the Republic of Vietnam. He'd chosen the unknown, but when the time came, he reconsidered and went AWOL from the induction center. 2 SPs had found him in a snooker hall 4 blocks away and educated him on the Marine Corps' lack of a sense of humor in such matters. Things hadn't improved much after that. The 4 months of basic training that followed had been one long, uninterrupted stretch of disciplinary guard duty. And then came the RVN. Evans had been universally disliked by the other men from the beginning. He'd been nothing but trouble to them since setting foot in Da Nang, and the lieutenant had been working on the necessary paperwork to get him transferred, but given personnel shortages and the ever-increasing mission tempo, the paperwork kept getting lost at headquarters. What no one in the unit could comprehend was why Jimmie Carl had befriended the boy, had sought him out when all others had turned a shoulder. It made no sense to anyone. Now, sitting in 6 inches of fetid red-black muck at the bottom of the shallow crater, Jimmie Carl inventoried his options. He had the boy's M14 with maybe a full clip of ammo, maybe less. He didn't think Evans had gotten off a shot before he caught the stray in his gut. He also had his meds kit. Evans appeared to have 2 high-explosive M26 grenades and an M18 smoke canister clipped to his suspenders, and he also was carrying one of the unreliable handheld PRC-6 handy-talkie radios that no one else in the squad had wanted to lug around due to the weight, and so had foisted on the unpopular private. Options. Options. There were no options. In this case, there was only one outcome. Jimmie Carl Trimble was dead, and unlike the motionless Evans, he knew it. Even now, in the time that it had taken to examine the kid and survey his vitals, they had closed the distance. Above the oily pall of cordite and dust, above the leaking, mortal stench of Evans, he could smell them now. They were that close. In about 5 minutes, Jimmie Carl Trimble, whoever he was, whoever he had become, would cease to exist. Maybe that wasn't a bad thing. Maybe it was all for the best. Maybe it didn't matter, but just as certain as his own death was the fact that 10 minutes after that, maybe even less, 2 companies of well-trained North Vietnamese regulars would fall upon the fractured remnants of his platoon, and they, too, would cease to exist. Unless someone did something fast. Jimmie Carl looked again at the radio slung around Evans's shoulder. Maybe there was an option. Dwayne, can you read me? Over. The heavy piece of shit PRC on his radio man's back snapped and hissed as First Lieutenant Dwayne Crockett reached for the handpiece to reply. He'd gotten his men well back into the trees and was establishing a tight perimeter that he hoped they could hold until the helos got there. The radio handpiece was packed with mud, and he had to smack it repeatedly against his thigh to clear it. He could tell from his medic's tone of voice and minimal radio formality that things were going critical. The use of his first name on the radio rather than a call sign or code words, the raw desperation, it added up to a grab-ass situation, and Jimmie Carl wasn't the type to panic without reason. Since arriving in Vietnam almost a year ago, Jimmie Carl had proven himself pragmatic to the point of fearlessness. Dwayne Crockett keyed the microphone and responded with the same informal efficiency. "I'm here, Jimmie Carl. What's your situation? Over." He fought to keep his voice calm and even, to not betray his surprise that Jimmie Carl was still alive. "Up a creek. Got Evans with me. Over." Even with the hiss and static of the radio, the thick honey in Jimmie Carl's slow southern drawl was discernible. "Hope your paddle's bigger than mine, buddy. What's your position? Over." "That 3rd bomb crater we passed on the way in from the LZ. The small one." "It's bad, Dwayne. Evans is probably already gone. Popping some smoke. Over." Jimmie Carl flicked the smoke grenade over the lip of the crater. It sputtered momentarily, and then began ejecting a thick, stuttering plume of rust-colored smoke. "Got your position break," Dwayne Crockett replied as he craned his head over the tall grass. Over the last 6 months, he'd allowed himself to get close to the quiet Navy corpsman. He'd come to rely heavily on him, his maturity and sound judgment. Now, as he watched the plume of smoke rise in the distance, he took stock of his remaining men, gauging what they were really capable of doing. He looked back over his shoulder. No sign of the incoming helicopters. He keyed the microphone again. "Sit tight, Jimmie Carl. We're going to work our way back down the tree line and lay down a covering fire. You'll need to come to us. Break. Leave Evans. I say again, leave Evans." "Over." "Negative, Lieutenant," Jimmie Carl responded quickly. There's a whole lot of bad guys here that want to have a talk with y'all, and they'll be crawling up your skinny coon ass soon enough. Do not, I say again,